what I'm going to suggest is that our minds are field-like, that they're not confined to the inside of the head. They spread out into the environment around us. And because our minds are extended beyond our brains, they can have effects at a distance, which are surprising from the conventional point of view, and help to make sense of a range of controversial phenomena like telepathy. I'm suggesting that minds are field-like and spread out beyond brains in a similar way to the way that magnetic fields spread out beyond magnets, cell phone fields spread out beyond cell phones, and the Earth's gravitational field stretches out far beyond the Earth. Here you see a flock of starlings. The flock can fly together. They can turn immensely quickly without bumping into each other. Here are some other pictures of flocks of birds, of starlings, and the astonishing maneuvers that they make. Some of you will be familiar with animation, computer animations of bird flocks like Craig Reynolds' classic Boyd's model from the 80s, which seem to show you can just explain it by nearest neighbor sensations. Actually, you can't. Those models are biologically naive. They assume that birds look at their nearest neighbor, process the information, adjust their flight, and change direction. That takes a lot of time. Nervous systems work slowly compared with computers. And the birds are reacting too fast for that to happen. The best computer models are field models that treat the whole flock as a field phenomenon. And I think they are indeed field phenomena, that members of social groups are linked through social fields or morphic fields of the social group. The same applies, of course, to schools of fish, like this one. And especially when predators attack, they can scatter in different directions very rapidly without bumping into each other. The whole group seems to move as a unit, as a kind of field. And the individuals move in response to the field, which is both produced by the individuals and acts back upon them. It's more than the sum of the parts acting. It's a kind of emergent field phenomenon. With dogs and cats, another very common phenomenon is the animals knowing when their owners are coming home. A lot of dogs and cats wait at a door or window when the owner's on the way home. Even if they come at non-routine times, even if they come by public transport, even if they're in a friend's car, and even if the people at home don't know when they're coming. Well, is this just an illusion? When I discussed it with one of my skeptical colleagues in Cambridge, Nicholas Humphrey, who's a psychologist, to my surprise, he didn't deny the phenomenon. In fact, he said, well, my dog used to do that. My mother always knew when I was coming home, the dog would go to the door. And I said, but surely the dog couldn't have heard your car from the other side of Cambridge, from many miles away, against all the traffic that's there, irrespective of the wind direction. And he said, oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing they've got. And because he and I differ in many respects in our opinions, yet we share a belief in science and scientific method, this led to the idea for an experiment. And the experiment is, the person goes at least 5 miles from home. The place where the dog waits is filmed continuously on time-coded videotape. The person comes home at a randomly chosen time communicated via pager. They don't know that in advance. The people at home, if any, don't know when they're coming. And to avoid familiar car sounds, they travel by unfamiliar vehicles, like taxis. Well, I've now done hundreds of those kinds of experiments with dogs, and the results are pretty clear-cut. The dogs go and start waiting over and over again when the person's coming home. In fact, with the most sensitive dogs, when they form the intention to come home before they've even got into the taxi. This research has been written up, it's published in journals. You can see the full reports on my website. In these experiments with dogs that know when their owners are coming home, we've done lots of these experiments. You can read the details online if you want to. But basically, what these graphs show is the number of seconds the dog stays at the window, and these are 10-minute intervals after the person leaves home. You see, the dog does sometimes go to the window when they're not coming home, like here and here. And when you see the videos, in most of these cases, they're going to look at things going on outside, to bark at passing cats and so on. They're obviously not waiting, but we've included all the data so there's no bias introduced by any subjective judgment. What you see is the 10 minutes of the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey, there, and there. The dogs are at the window most, and they're there also before the person actually gets in the car and the car starts moving. That's because people form the intention to go home before the car actually moves. You have to think about it before you get in the car. But the highest amount of time at the window is when they're on the way home. These data were, of course, challenged by skeptics. As you know, anything to do with telepathy is immensely controversial. There are vigilante organizations that have been set up to try and discredit research of this kind. There are active groups of highly motivated skeptics. They vastly outnumber researchers in this field. The total number of subscribers to skeptical magazines in the US is about 100,000. The total number of full-time researchers in parapsychology is about 5. So they're outnumbered about 20,000 to 1 by well-organized groups of skeptics. And so, of course, and rightly so, this work was criticized by skeptics. One of them, Richard Wiseman, a British media skeptic and psychologist, said that I must have made mistakes in the result, faulty randomization, the wrong kind of vehicle to bring people home. So I invited him to do his own experiments with with one of the same dogs, the same dog I worked with here. And these are the results of the 3 experiments he did in the same location. As you see, it's an almost perfect replication. The most time the dog was at the window was in the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey. And showed exactly the same kind of pattern. At first, he argued these refuted my results because the dog went to the window before the owner set off, and the rest of the data could therefore be discarded. But in fact, most people don't think that's a valid approach. I certainly don't. He himself now admits that this is, in fact, a replication of the effect. He doesn't agree with my interpretation, but his own results clearly replicated the same pattern as my own. And people often say, why don't you apply for the Randi Prize? Well, it's a very good question, and I can tell you my answer. First of all, this man is not a scientist. He has no scientific credentials or understanding. On his website, it says the prize must be won for people who produce an unequivocal demonstration of psi abilities that requires no expert analysis. That seems to rule out any statistical experiments. Then he's later said, oh, well, I will accept statistical experiments, but the odds against chance have got to be 1,000,000 to 1 to get the $1 million prize. So if the odds against chance are 900,000 to 1, you fail the test. Third, you sign over to Randi all publicity rights. You have all legal waivers. So he has complete control of all publicity arising from this. And fourth, and most important for me, he's a liar. He's a deceiver by profession, and he's a deceiver by nature. And my reason for saying this, without being sued for libel, is that he wrote an article in a magazine about my dog research called Dog World. Probably very few of you read Dog World, but lots of people do. And in this, he said that we at the James Randi Educational Foundation have repeated Sheldrake's experiments. They fail. Then he said, we've also examined all his videotape from his experiments and shown the dog goes to the window all the time. And it's not as he says it is. An unequivocal statement. I emailed him asking him to give me the details of the experiments he'd done. What journal were they published in? Where's the data? Reasonable questions that a scientist would ask. He didn't reply. I emailed again, he didn't reply. So I emailed his scientific advisory board, and they advised him to reply. So he then replied, and he said, well, actually, these experiments were done many years ago when I looked after a friend's dogs for a couple of weeks in New York, and I lost all the data. They were lost in a flood, so I've got no data, and they've never been written up. So what kind of evidence is that? If I produce evidence for psi and say, well, I did them years ago, I've lost all the data, but just believe me, he wouldn't go for that, I'm sure. And then the examination of the videotapes, he had to admit he'd never seen the videotapes. He'd simply made that up. Now, with a man with such a low degree of honesty, I don't think he should be an arbiter of scientific credibility or truth. I do believe, however, that real skeptics, people with proper skeptic scientific training and who have a track record of honesty rather than dishonesty, are worth engaging with, and that's why I'm doing joint experiments with Professor Chris French right now.